Carbon border adjustment mechanism is not just a random climate policy that the global business community has to deal with when it comes to sustainability reporting. CBAM could most likely change global and national trade patterns and reshape economic orders for carbon-intensive sectors covered under CBAM, including iron and steel, cement, and aluminium. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism (CBAM) is rapidly emerging as a transformative force in global trade dynamics, reshaping cross-border supply chains, investment decisions, and compliance obligations for exporters to the European Union. In this video, we examine how CBAM is redefining the global trade environment, its implications for exporters and supply chains, and the strategic steps businesses must take to future-proof operations in a carbon-constrained economy. How could CBAM change economic orders? It is not so hard to guess that CBAM will disproportionately impact the developed and the developing country. Besides altering the global economic direction, the carbon pricing mechanism developed by the EU will impact and affect the competitiveness of developing countries. For instance, CBAM could most likely cause an annual welfare gain of US $141 billion for economically developed countries and an annual welfare loss of $106 billion for the economically vulnerable countries or developing countries, as per a study by the Task Force on Climate Development and International Monetary Fund. Other developing countries, including Ukraine, Egypt, Mozambique, and Turkey, could incur the economic losses of $1 billion to $5 billion. A comprehensive study by the Foundation for European Progressive Studies revealed that the world's largest steel producer, China, could end up paying $162.11 per ton exports, which is $189.02 per ton per exports for India, and $189.87 ton for Russia, 67 for Turkey, and 73 per ton for US after the CBAM is implemented in full-fledged manner. Reports also suggest that India, Georgia, and Ukraine could most likely suffer the cost increase of greater than 10% in comparison to manufacturers in the European Union. Although the CBAM is applicable only for 6 sectors now, such as cement, iron and steel, aluminium, electricity, fertilizers, and hydrogen, the economic impacts that it could leave on the businesses are of massive scale. The entire carbon pricing mechanism, which is a replica of the European Union Emissions Trading System (EU ETS), was introduced to prevent carbon leakage and facilitate fair trade practices. These impacts are only set to increase further as CBAM is going to cover all the sectors, industries, and services under the EU ETS gradually in the future. What are the factors deciding CBAM impact? Sector-wise impact of CBAM will be seen in the iron and steel industry, which is one of the most carbon-intensive sectors. Primary reasons for increased CBAM could cause economic ripples for businesses, including the emissions intensity of the CBAM product, scale and amount of CBAM goods exported to the EU, and the kind of dependency on the EU market to sell the CBAM goods from outside the Commission. Another critical factor is the absence of already existing infrastructure and credible systems in place for carbon accounting for countries like India, Brazil, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. For instance, Zimbabwe depends on the EU for the purchase of 92% of its iron and steel products, and India, which is second largest steel producer, has one of the biggest carbon-intensive industries. Moreover, India was also ranked the 4th most exposed country to CBAM risk due to its increased CBAM trade volume with the EU in 2023, as per the Center for European Reform. Notably, iron and steel represented 78% of India's CBAM exports to the European Union in the year 2023. How CBAM shifts global trade dynamics? Let's look at them one by one. First, change in trade patterns. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism (CBAM) is placing significant pressures on global suppliers, especially those in developing economies and countries, to align with the EU carbon standards. Exporters lacking robust emissions accounting systems may begin redirecting their higher carbon products to markets outside the EU that do not enforce CBAM-like mechanism. For example, a steel manufacturer in India may strategically pivot exports towards non-EU markets to avoid CBAM-related carbon taxation and added compliance costs. Second, supply chain restructuring. Now, CBAM is catalyzing a two-tiered restructuring of global supply chains. internal reshuffling within the EU. EU importers, also known as declarants, are likely to prioritize intra-EU suppliers with cleaner production methods to reduce the complexity and cost associated with CBAM compliance. Moreover, non-EU buyers may see an uptick in supply from regions like Asia or Africa as exporters seek alternatives to the EU market. Then comes increased product pricing. The imposition of a carbon border tax will inflate prices, and suppliers will need to factor in their own compliance costs. EU exporters are exported, then preference for low carbon products. EU importers are expected to favor suppliers with lower embedded emissions to minimize the CBAM liabilities. Countries that incentivize green manufacturing and emissions reductions will gain preferential access to the EU markets. Risk of trade conflicts. The global expansion of CBAM could intensify trade frictions. Developing countries and nations with significant CBAM exposure, such as India, China, and South Africa, have voiced a strong opposition, labeling the mechanism unilateral and potentially discriminatory trade measure. Retaliatory tariffs and regulatory countermeasures may emerge in response. CBAM also represents an opportunity to innovate and adopt low-carbon technologies, helping the sector remain competitive and aligned with India's net zero aspirations. To gain more clarity on how CBAM is going to impact the Indian iron and steel sector, please check our website cleancarbon.ai.